All right. I think we're good, Mr. Aguiar. I believe
Very
we're
excited to
live
do
on
this with you,
Twitter.
Joe.
We had some technical difficulties with getting tough to believe with me running the control panel, but I think we're going now, man. I'm Joe. Welcome into the Turn Golf Pod, presented by Rotoballer. Glad to be with you for the Wells Fargo Championship. Very excited. AP is off tonight. He is raising funds for the kids play free with Scott Stallings dinner. So my good friend, one of my best friends, Spencer Aguiar, is pinch hitting for Andrew tonight. Good to see you, Spencer. Thanks for being with us, man. How you been?
I've been good, Joe. It's always a pleasure doing this show with you. It's going to be fun running through this board for the Wells Fargo. Any of these elevated events always gives you a field that's worth talking about. And I'm excited to do this tonight.
Yeah, man. Really excited. Glad you could make the time to be with us. I know you're always super busy, so really appreciate you stopping by. And yeah, man, this is a great event. Really excited to dive into it with you. We're going to go through the DraftKings salary scale with Spencer, talk a little bit about the golf course and some of our favorite plays in every price point. This was kind of an elevated event before there were elevated events, Spencer. The Wells Fargo always draws a great field. Quail Hollow Golf Club is a really well. It hosted the 2017 PGA Championship, hosted the President's Cup recently, so a major championship caliber golf course. So we got a lot to talk about, a lot to kind of dissect tonight with a really good field and a really good golf course. First of all, I want to send all of y'all to check out Spencer's stuff, my stuff, our buddy Byron's stuff. Josh Bennett's doing great things. We brought Ian McNeil on this year over at rotoballer.com. Um, Tons of great free PGA content. You can use our optimizer. You can use our research station. That's all premium. And you can sign up for a Spencer package, the Tee Off Sports VIP package, and get all of Spencer's picks for the week, all of his DraftKings thoughts for the week. Get access to his model. Just use promo code TOFF when you sign up, and you'll get a discount on that. That'll help Spencer out, and we hope you'll join us. We got a lot of golf left this year, 3 majors to go. So head over to rotoballer.com now and use that promo code to save a little money. Spencer, we're coming off Mexico, coming off Zurich, a couple of kind of quiet tournaments. Tony Finau with the big win. He and John Rahm were the two best players in the field last week. They battled it out. Did you have any takeaways from Mexico before we jump into the Wells Fargo?
Not really. I think when we look at Finau, it's one of the things I've been writing about and talking about on podcasts for the past 2 months or so. When we look at Finau's statistical profile that he's put together here recently, like it, I know every finish had landed inside the top 35 for him in 2023, but I kept saying that something has to give at some point. The stats were way too good to not get this victory to come for him. So I wasn't shocked that he won from an outright betting perspective. I had problems getting there at the number that it was, but like in my DraftKings article, he was essentially my lock button play at the top where, you could make an argument that removing Rom from the player pool altogether maybe wasn't the smartest decision there, but I decided where it was one of those spots where Rom was 50% owned. He was $12,000. I thought Tony Finau was about 40% to beat him in a one-on-one matchup, which he did. So I played a bunch of Finau last week. Some of the pieces around him could have been slightly better. I went way too overweight to, a golfer like Alex Smalley, who I guess at this point I have to look the other way when I see him on my model because he's somebody who always grades well and hasn't necessarily been what I've wanted from him recently. But like, as you said, we put in a lot of work here at Rotoballer. We try to provide the best information that we can for everybody out there that either reads the work or obviously watches your guys' show with you and Andrew here at the Turn. So if you're not doing so already, definitely be sure to check all of that out.
Yeah, it was kind of a weird week, man. As you mentioned, John Rahm. It was kind of the big decision of the week was what do you do with John Rahm? I don't think hardly anybody was betting him at those numbers, and probably really similar with Tony with where he was. It was kind of a 2 man field, and then a huge drop to the rest of the field, and Tony was kind of there in the middle a little bit, kind of the 1B to Rahm's 1A. So it was an interesting week to try to figure out what to do. But this week we don't have that problem, man. A very deep field has turned up in Charlotte for the Wells Fargo. Tell me a little bit about Quail Hollow, Spencer. Then we're going to dive into the DraftKings slate, man. Just move right along. But this is a championship caliber golf course. Hosted a major, hosted the President's Cup. Very long. Give me a little details and your thoughts on Quail Hollow.
Yeah, this is a big boy golf course. It's 7,554 yards, par 71. You talked about how last year it hosted the President's Cup, so it wasn't in action. We saw it for the 2017 PGA Championship. I think it's a rather straightforward course at the end of the day. Like what you see is what you get here. I think being plus in distance is obviously going to be important. You don't necessarily have to be the longest player in the world to find success. We've seen players that have more of that, Patrick Reed sort of game be able to find success out here before, but it kind of comes down to that you either have to be a good ball striker, you need to have some quality of distance, and then it really comes down to the long iron proximity for me. So nearly 73% of the shots come from 150 plus yards. That's a really big increase over the baseline expectation there. I think the other thing that comes into play is that you get these lightning quick Bermuda greens. That kind of adds its own sinister nature to the equation here, just because you're coming in from a really long distance. And then because these greens are firm and fast, it's a little bit more difficult and challenging to stop them on this surface. So I'm kind of trying to find that like 1A, 1B combination myself for this event, where I want to find the golfer where find me the player that can get it long enough out there off the tee shot and position himself in a position to where they're also a good iron player from 150 plus yards. We've seen historically players like Victor Hovland, Cameron Young, those might not be the short game specialists that you think of. And I kind of think like, yes, you get a 4% reduction in GIR percentage here over a typical stop on tour, but it's a really easy up and down for most of these shots for these players. And that's kind of why I keep going back to the answer of ball striker over anything else, because if you're people are going to miss greens here anytime you get a reduction, that's going to come into play. And if it's an easier thing to do, like find me the player that is getting it longer on the first shot and then also has that prerequisite I'm looking for of being able to be a quality long iron player. And it kind of leads a very specific prototype of a golfer that you're looking for. It doesn't necessarily disqualify a player like Matthew Fitzpatrick, who graded well in my model, but I think it's kind of find that prototype and then move on from there with it. And I'm sure we'll talk about a lot of those players here shortly.
Yeah. Let's just jump right in, man. Let's start talking about some guys. You mentioned about some players while talking a little bit about Quail Hollow, and we'll dig in a little bit more as we go through the salary scale. Let's start up at the top. Rory McIlroy, coming off a couple week layoff, elected not to play at Hilton Head after a disastrous outing at the Masters, but he's been tremendous at Quail Hollow. We'll talk about him a little bit more in just a second, but let's talk about some of the players above 10K, Spencer. We got Rory at 11-1, the only player above 11K. Xander at 10-7, Patrick Cantlay 10-5, Tony Finau 10-2. These are guys that have just been uber consistent this year, Spencer. Rory's kind of the main man at Quail Hollow, former winner here, multiple winner here. It was the site of his very first PGA Tour victory in his career. So he's got a lot of good vibes at Quail Hollow. Won here in 2021. I mentioned in my article this week that the last time Rory missed back-to-back cuts, the Players and the Masters, was in 2021, and then he came to Quail Hollow and won. So it's kind of eerily similar how he's coming into this event, looking to kind of bounce back. And historically, when you kind of think about it and look back, Rory's done very well after big disappointments. So I think this is an event where he can bounce back. He's probably the top play up here at the top for me, Spencer. But what are your thoughts on some of these other guys? A really strong, really consistent group above 10K this week.
Yeah, I think with Rory, anytime that you get these tree line courses to where he can use his driving distance and his just total driving acumen in general, I guess the ownership is going to be the only question of what does he actually come in at, but I find it very challenging to not want to play him this week. Like I see about 25% right now. It would have to get higher than that for me to take him out. And, I haven't necessarily narrowed down the player pool the way that it needs to be at this point, and we're going to do this throughout the next 24 plus hours to where more ownership comes in and I run more numbers at the back end of this model that I run. But he's in the player pool for me. The one thing that was interesting with Xander is I was really interested to jump on the Xander train this week because I think the first thing that you see that kind of sticks out, and I don't necessarily think it's an egregious difference here, but he's very expensive compared to the other golfers here. I was not expecting him to be the second most expensive player on the board. And I thought that that would give you a reduction in ownership. That hasn't been the case right now. I'm seeing about 16% owned from him. So I'm curious to see where that number goes. But as of right now, Cantlay is probably the one golfer that I am not going to take on. Obviously, new caddy on the bag. He's bringing Tiger's man over. So, we'll see what can happen there. And I think the one thing everybody's going to think is what Tesori did for Cameron Young in that short change that happened. But I don't know. There are some concerns I have with Cantlay. I see 20% ownership, kind of some other routes I'd rather go. So he's really the only one that I've removed from the equation right now. But you said it best, Joe. Like, we're dealing with 4 golfers that are top 10 win equity choices for me. So it's not like anybody's some egregious fade option that I just immediately wanted to get rid of them. It's just really comes down to a numbers game at the end of the day of where do I think I can pivot? Where do I think I can create my best leverage? I'm hoping that people talk themselves out of Rory to some extent to maybe lower that percentage a little bit. But, even if we're looking at a 25% total, like you said it best, this has been the venue for him historically. 9 consecutive finishes inside the top 16 here. 8 of those have come inside the top 10. It's the 2 victories since 2012. It's kind of just a perfect venue for him all the way around. And, anybody who follows my work at Rotoballer knows how heavy I was on Rory for the Masters. I thought he was going to win the green jacket, and he kind of face planted, unfortunately, which has been the case for him in majors over the last handful of years, but really, really good bounce back spot for him here.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, great bounce back spot. He loves this golf course. Had a few weeks to kind of clear his head, and I think it's worth noting, Spencer. We kind of glossed over, but it's certainly notable. John Rahm and Scotty Scheffler not in this field this week. So it's a kind of a clear path for Rory. Up at the top of the board, when you take Rahm out, when you take Schauffele out, or I'm sorry, take Scheffler out, and you're looking at guys like like Xander, like Cantlay, like Finau, and some more guys that we'll get into. The talent level kind of compresses a little bit for me. It feels like without a John Rahm and or a Scotty Scheffler teeing it up this week, so that's certainly notable as we get into the salary scale. But a really deep 9K range. We can say that about every price point this week. Colin Morikawa, Jordan Spieth has played extremely well this year. Hadn't been able to get a win, but has been in contention multiple times. Max Homa won this event last year at a different golf course, but he also won at Quail Hollow in 2019. So there's terrific course history here. He's got really good vibes going with this tournament as a whole. You mentioned Matt Fitzpatrick. Victor Hovland is a guy that I really like this week. Spencer Sungjae. And then your man, Jason Day, another former winner of this event. So talk to me a little bit about the 9K range. I know you want to hit on Jason Day, I'm sure, but talk to me a little bit about these other guys.
Let me ask you this question, Joe, before we move on, because I'm curious to your answer here, because you said it best. This is a very heavy $9,000 range with a lot of golfers, like so much so to where I can't get myself to fade Rory at the top, but if you kind of want to eliminate most of those other names and kind of get heavier in this $9,000 range with your exposure, I think that is certainly a route to consider. But I want to flip the question to you here. Is there a golfer in this section that would be, I guess, let's say fade, let's go all the way with it. Is there a fade candidate for you that you dislike over everybody else?
I can, Sung Jae is very consistent. He's a great golfer, so I'm not trashing Sung Jae. But if I'm circling one that I can just fade, it's going to be Sung Jae here at this price tag. He's very consistent, but he's also, you kind of worry about his upside a little bit. He's not winning a lot of golf tournaments, kind of like we thought he would. Jordan Spieth is a guy that we know the volatility that comes with his game. and this is not a golf course or a golf tournament that he normally plays. So there's certainly some question marks there. Same can be said of Colin Morikawa, who's kind of failed to really get it fully going. Max Homa, after a unbelievable West Coast swing, has been relatively quiet, but you have to like his chances of bouncing back this week. Matt Fitzpatrick, we've not seen him on this golf course, in the Wells Fargo. And J Day, I really like. Victor Hovland is maybe my favorite play on this slate. So Sung Jae would be the guy I would leave out. Vic would be my favorite. What about you, man? Do you have a least favorite and a favorite in this range?
I think ownership aside, there's four golfers for me that I am trying to figure out how much exposure I want to them because I like all four of them. So that would be Max Homa, Matthew Fitzpatrick, Victor Hovland. He's going to be very popular, but it's kind of like the same answer that I gave with Rory, where I find it difficult to want to leave him off of my player pool this week. I mean, he's second in my model. He's first for safety. He's not missing cuts at this point. He's presenting some upside, even if he's not winning some of these events. So I like Hovland, but the one different answer I'll give to you that I actually might say that he's my favorite play in this section would be Sungjae Im. And the reason why I say that is we finally get him now into the $9,000 range. And I have been calling for this for like the past 3 months, where he's been this underpriced commodity over and over and over again. And he's going off at like 30% ownership. And that's a really tough pill to swallow at that point when everybody's playing him. And I'd rather just try to pivot elsewhere. I'm seeing about 12.5% right now. This is one of those golf courses where the winning score is going to probably be somewhere between 8 under par to 12 or 13 under par. So you're looking at like either single digits or very small into that 10, 11, 12 under range. That's the prototypical event where I think Sungjae can find success with just the overall safety that he brings to the table. He's the number one player in my model when it comes to weighted scoring. So what that really means is when I run my model, I try to mimic each hole that's being played. I try to give a projected scoring output for each player on those holes, and then I compare them against every other golfer in the field to figure it out. So Sungjae on all 18 holes ended up being the number one player for me. That's kind of a really interesting answer that I wasn't expecting when this week started. And there's 4 other categories of the 6 that I ran that placed him inside the top 10. So you kind of get that safe profile mixed in with some of the upside there. So I really like Sungjae. I think he's going to be, if not the lowest owned, one of the lowest owned. And it's kind of the same reason why I'm going to say I like Matthew Fitzpatrick this week. Yes, we haven't seen him out here at this particular course. And yes, he doesn't necessarily have the distance prerequisite that you're asking for. I don't think he's short, but he's not going to give you that top 10 upside for distance. And the weighted proximity is kind of all over the map. But even with all that being said, like when I ran all the Bermuda stuff and difficult courses and trying to scramble and avoid bogey on these tracks, it's like there's a reason why Fitzpatrick historically has performed at a lot of these challenging majors, including winning the US Open last season. So I think he might be an interesting leverage play for me. And, so those 4 guys specifically. And then I do have some question marks with Colin Morikawa. I think I give that answer every single time. And I fade him in spots. I think the ownership's fine. I see about 13.5% right now. I don't think that's a number to where it is so, it's kind of in the middle. To me, that's a fair number at an overpriced tag that he got. So I took him out of my player pool right now. Spieth is 7th overall for me. The one downside I had for him was that weighted scoring that I ran. There's essentially 2 players in the $9,000 and up section that graded outside of the top 15 for me when it came to weighted scoring. And it just so happens that both of these 2 golfers graded outside the top 40. The first would be Jordan Spieth. I don't know necessarily if I want to put it into just one stat there and say that he can't find success. When Jordan gets hot like not very many players can. So I have not made a decision if he's in my player pool yet or not. I'm leaning towards the out part of it. And then this is a very tough answer to give. I kind of want my mic muted here so this doesn't get heard by people, but I'm probably not going to play Jason Day this week. I think there's an overall level of safety that he does bring to the table, but here's what I worry about, Joe, is let's even get rid of Sungjae for a second. Let's compare him to Hovland, if you want to go $200 up, and then let's compare him to Justin Thomas, Cameron Young, Sam Burns. like, do we think at this point that Jason Day has more upside to win this event than any of those players that I said? And maybe the answer is yes to you, but I don't think he has more upside to win. And there's a lot of ownership that's being put in his direction right now. So, like, I think he's a fine cash game play, which is a weird answer to give for somebody that obviously runs into ailments and runs into problems here and there with it. And I do believe he's a top 15 player in the world. And the stats are starting to show that right now. But I'd almost rather make him beat me if he's going to be 20% owned. He's in the $9,000 range. And I tend to think that Hovland has more upside. Cameron Young has more upside. Sam Burns has more upside. Justin Thomas is a different area there because he's also getting a lot of ownership. And I think his floor is very, very low this week. But if Thomas pops, that's the kind of golfer that can win this tournament. We saw it in 2017 at the PGA Championship. So I don't know. I'm probably out on Day for that reason. That's a tough answer to give, but it's just one of those things where it's really difficult pricing here. Like, you have all the best players in the world that are not named Rahm and Scheffler. You have to condense a player pool somehow, because if you're in this spot where, like, every single player I named so far, every player we've talked about is inside the top 16 of my model, there's no egregious difference to where it's like, wow, this guy should be faded in every matchup. You should be taken out from your player pool. It's just, there's minor differences. And when the minor difference comes into play, you have to eliminate people or else you end up playing everybody. And that's what we don't want to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm honestly shocked to hear you say that, Spencer. But I think you're 100% accurate. The price point on Jason Day's tough at 9K. I question the upside, especially when we consider those that are around him. So I think we're in total lockstep there. I think he's a good play, fine play, but this is kind of what we've talked about before in the past, when we've talked about major championships. You have to make some tough decisions, and this is one of those. This is one of those salary scales, kind of the opposite of what we saw last week, where you're scrambling for guys to play. This week, you got to start tossing some guys out, and making some difficult decisions, especially in GPPs. You do kind of wonder about Jason Day's upside, even though he's been a vastly improved player this year, and he's played well at Quail Hollow. It's one of those things where I'm gonna keep an eye on the ownership as the week progresses. Another player that I feel like's in a very, very similar spot to Jason Day will pop down into the 8K range, Spencer, is Ricky Fowler at 8,800. They feel like really similar players to me. Maybe it's because they're around the same age. They've both kind of been down, been kind of at the bottom of the barrel, and they're working their way back up. Ricky has played extremely well. It feels real this time. I'll get your thoughts on that, but it feels real this time with Ricky. There's been kind of the big thing that he's been missing, which he's finally rediscovered this year, is consistency. Playing extremely well, logging solid finishes, striking the ball well from tee to green. The irons have been solid. He's gained strokes on approach in every single start of 2023. So, really like Ricky there. But as with Jason Day, you kind of wonder about the upside. Some guys I don't question the upside with. The guy you mentioned, JT, won the PGA Championship on this golf course in 2017. We haven't seen him kind of live up to what we're used to seeing from him so far this year, but we know that can change at any point. So I don't doubt the upside of Justin Thomas, and the same can be said of Cameron Young, at least for me. I feel like, this is a guy that's got a breakthrough win coming. You love his distance off the tee. He's up there near the top of the PGA Tour in driving distance, along with Rory and Cameron Champ. So you have to think this is going to be a terrific fit for him. Talk to me about any of those guys. Love to get your thoughts on Ricky, Spencer, as well as anybody else in the 8K you might like.
Yeah, I don't think it's one of those situations too. It's like when you play DFS, you obviously want as much information to enter the market as you can get. So really what we're looking for here is where the ownership goes on some of these players. Like, there's going to be certain golfers that are more or less lock button plays for me, assuming like the ownership that I currently see. Obviously the trajectory of that can always move and you have to make decisions based off of that. But I think that's the biggest takeaway that I would give to everybody is I kind of tend to think that a lot of times people that put together their player pools get too stuck in this mindset that this is the player that I have to play. And then they don't incorporate the new data that enters the mix over like the, Tuesday night, Wednesday evening during that time period there. So there's always changes that can be made. But looking at the board that we have right now on the way that this is set up, I kind of do like Ricky myself for all the reasons that you said. I see about 15% ownership. I think that's about 5% less than we're at least anticipated to get on a lot of these other golfers that we've talked about so far. You can kind of see with certain players, like specifically with the way I build my model, I run everything from a 2-year duration of time. So there's certain players like Jason Day, Ricky Fowler, even a Wyndham Clark that they're just slow to move for me, that it's taking too much of the stats from 2 years ago. And as tournaments go, it keeps incorporating more of the data in. And I'm comfortable running it that way because I don't want to overreact to situations. I think that's like one of the negative things that people do with sports betting is you see a guy for 2 consecutive tournaments play well, and then all of a sudden the guy's gone from 200 to 1 down to 40 to 1 to win the event, and all the value's gone at that point. So I never try to overreact to any of the movements that take place. So when I do see movements happen in my model, and I've seen it happen with Jason Day, which I alluded to him, I think he's a top 15 golfer in the world at this point. And I kind of have seen enough from a statistical perspective where I think Ricky Fowler's in the same exact spot. It's a really good course for him. Anytime that you get these total driving tests where I think he can use that skill set, that's a really enticing thing. And I guess I would make the same argument that you said to an extent, to where he's a better safe play than maybe some of these upside numbers that I'm looking for. But then again, that's also me taking a 2-year sample size, and maybe it hasn't incorporated all of what I'm trying to find here with Ricky yet. So he's in my player pool. I haven't removed them yet. And there's a lot of players that are still in my player pool, and we're going to cut this down as the week goes on more so. But just to touch on a few other guys that maybe haven't been mentioned yet, I do tend to really like Sam Burns this week. I see about 12.5% ownership. I think he can be one of the pivots in this section, whether that's off of a player that we've discussed previously or just a player that makes a lot of sense to put into your lineup. He's top 10 in all iterations of how I ran my sheet. I do like Tommy Fleetwood this week. Right now, I see sub 10% ownership for him, inside the top 20 in all iterations for me there. He has positive trajectory for upside to win this event. So I think that Fleetwood and Burns combination are probably like the 2 golfers that I'm going to be heavier on than consensus. I don't see people necessarily going that route. And then it's just going to be, how do I want to sprinkle this in with the rest of the names? Like, we have a Tom Kim here at about 5%. I always think Tom Kim creates some interesting leverage. Like, the price is probably fair for what we're getting here. But that's fine for me if it means that we're creating that leverage in a different way with 5% ownership. So he's currently under consideration. I think Tyrrell Hatton is an interesting name to keep in the back of your mind right now, inside the top 20 for me in most of the ways that I ran it. Obviously, the weighted proximity is another story here, but anytime I think of Bermuda and fast Bermuda, you kind of think of these Tyrrell Hattons, you think of Sam Burns, these guys that can find success there. And then it's just really going to come down to ownership on Cameron Young. Right now, I see him. It's either him or Hovland that's probably going to be, or Rory. I guess those are the 3 that will be the most popular, but there's just so much to like about Cameron Young this week. Like, I've made this argument quite a few times that I guess, like, to me, Rory, Rahm, Scheffler, like, what all those guys have in common is they bring distance off the tee and quality long iron proximity. And those are the 3 elite players in the world. And there's really not any other golfer other than one that touches that range in my sheet. And that's Cameron Young. Cameron Young, to me, is a top 4 ball striker in the world. You always have to question the around the green game, the putter, how all that's going to come into play. But, this is a Webb Simpson course. You have Paul Tesori on the bag. Like, there's a lot to like about what he would be able to do with Cameron Young's game in a vacuum situation here. So, like I keep going back to, obviously ownership is going to be the answer that we need to figure out to make these decisions. Cause I don't know if I want to start making lineups. Like, if we're talking GPPs here, where it's 150 plus entries per contest, like, I don't necessarily want to start like chalk with Hovland and Young and Rory and going all that route. Like, that's more single entry of how I'm trying to build it. But I also don't want to remove any of these players from my player pool right now, because we're talking about the number 1, the number 2, and the number 3 players. Like, there's real rhyme and reason for why people are playing them, and it shows up from a statistical perspective.
Yeah, totally agree, man. I mean, the chalk is the chalk for a reason, right? These guys statistically fit this golf course. Their games fit this golf course. You mentioned the guys like Hovland, Cameron Young, Rory. There's a lot of overlap between the types of courses on which these guys have played well. It's probably not a coincidence we saw them all, in the running last year at St. Andrews. All three guys. All three played well at Bay Hill, with Riviera, Augusta, with these kind of classic, lengthy big boy golf courses. We saw those guys play well. That's leading to popularity, and it's tough to argue with. As you mentioned, unless you're talking from a GPP perspective, where you want to get a little bit contrarian, maybe get a pivot to some other players. I'm with you on Tommy Fleetwood. I really like him. He's a player I played a lot this year. He can be frustrating because we're still kind of waiting on that breakthrough win, but has really been in the mix a lot and played really well. So I like Fleetwood here. Had a T14 at Quail Hollow back in 2021. And Brian Harmon, this price is crazy to me at 8K. But in GPPs, I imagine his ownership is going to be really low. Two top 25s in his last two Quail Hollow starts. He won this event back in 2017, but it wasn't on this golf course. But he has played well at Quail Hollow. Had a T13 here in the 2017 PGA Championship, and he's coming off his best outing of the year at the Heritage. He'd been on a milk carton before then, so maybe if you want to kind of try to jump on that recent form, maybe a guy that's trending in the right direction in GPPs, Brian Harmon might be worth a look. Let's dive into the seven, Spencer. There's a lot to talk about here. Uh, Obviously, we can't hit on every player, but give me some of your highlights. I think there's a ton to love in the 7K range this week. A lot of quality players down here. Keith Mitchell popped for me, kind of pre-tournament research from a course history perspective. At Quail Hollow, we had a T3 in 2021 and a T8 in 2019. So there's a lot to like about Cashmere Keith from a course history perspective. There are several other players as we move kind of down the 7K salary scale. I think you can look at this week. The mid sevens feel really juicy. Emiliano Grillo is a guy that I wrote up this week. I like the course history, and we're seeing some really good form. And he's the kind of guy that when he gets hot tends to kind of stay hot. So I think there's something there with Emiliano Grillo that I'm willing to look at. Cameron Davis is a guy that let a lot of people down to kind of kick off the year, but we found out about an illness to start the year, and he's kind of trending back in the right direction. Davis Riley's a guy that I play every week. It doesn't always work out, but he's the type of player that has the ability to handle these long golf courses. Very explosive player. If he can get the driver going this week, you can kind of look out for Davis Riley. I feel like he's that caliber of player that he can find himself in contention this week. Coming off a win a couple of weeks ago at the Zurich, where he played extremely well, kind of carried that team. He and Nick Hardy won there, so that's got to be a confidence booster. But give me some of your thoughts on the seven, Spencer. I mean, there's tons of guys we can talk about. It feels like there's a lot to like here for me. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, there's a lot of names that popped out for me. I guess I'll rapid fire through some of the ones that stuck out more so than others and give a reason or two in a lot of these spots. So I'm curious to see where the ownership goes for Wyndham Clark, but it's like I kind of talked about it a second ago, but Wyndham Clark is a player for me where the long-term data is now starting to equal what we've seen from him recently. And really the big change with him is he's always been long off the tee. He's always been a quality putter. And now he's become a really immaculate approach player. So if that continues, that's kind of how you can get a win in like one of these sorts of fields here. And I think his distance is going to play well if he can keep those irons on track. And then he's obviously one of the better combinations of like putting and distance with that. So I think he's intriguing. I kind of like Siwoo Kim. That's going to be a leverage play for me at sub 5%. I think one of the things that everybody, when you always look at Siwoo Kim, you get this notion with him to where the general consensus is that he's very erratic, and I guess he technically is, but from a result standpoint, he's won here in 2023. If you take away the miscut that he had recently, I think he's been rather steady on tour here for the past, year, give or take with it. So I think that miscut that he has provided recently has kind of taken him off the board here, which it shouldn't be the case. Like, I don't really see much of a difference between him and Keith Mitchell and Corey Connors. Like the one big difference for me comes into play that nobody wants to play Siwoo Kim. And that is always what's intriguing to me, is when I can get a golfer that I think is very similar to where all the chalk is, but get them at sub 5% ownership. So I'm interested in him. Probably going to play Keegan Bradley just because of the upside numbers I have. I see the ownership trending upwards with him right now, but there's a lot to like about him from a ball striking perspective. Anytime you get him on a difficult course, I'll include the tournament last year, even though it wasn't held here, but 2 consecutive top 18 finishes at this tournament, the 18th place finish being here in 2021 at this course. So I think there's reasons to be optimistic about him. And then you talked a little bit about Cameron Davis. Like that's the epitome of boomer bust at the end of the day. And it's really just going to come down to where the ownership is, because I am a really big Cameron Davis truther, like maybe more so than 99.9% of people out there. But I also don't want to fall into the trap if Cameron Davis becomes 12%, because the floor is really low. The ceiling is top 20 potential, but I don't necessarily want to chase that if it does become a 12 to 15% plus option. I don't see that right now. I do think he's in play at the 6 to 7% I see, but it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. And then I guess the other player that I'll mention, at least from the 7,500 and up range, would be Patrick Rogers. And I make this comparison quite often. Rogers and Wyndham Clark are 2 very similar golfers to me. Like when one pops for me in my model, the other one usually does. And we've seen this change in Wyndham Clark's iron play that has really catapulted him to the next level here. But I think Rogers is a golfer that's a legitimate top 20 sort of option in this field. And at 9% ownership, you're kind of put in that range where he's a top 25 ownership play, but like he has the upside I'm looking for. The safety looks relatively fine with, 3 consecutive top 19 finishes for him. So I like Patrick Rogers this week. I kind of think he's if you want to say like the last real option, maybe outside of Steven Yeager, to where I think can actually win this tournament. That's probably where like the ship ends for me there.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's some interesting options for me as you kind of get down in the low 7Ks and even into the high 6s. We're talking GPP plays, but there's some guys I'm definitely gonna have some exposure to. But yeah, it feels like there's almost a cutoff point there, as you mentioned, in the mid 7Ks as far as guys that could actually win this event. But a couple of guys I like down at the bottom. Ben Martin's a player I've been playing a lot this year, Spencer. He's kind of like got a little Jordan Spieth flavor to him. His rounds can be roller coasters. From one hole to the next, he'll go on birdie binges and then make a double bogey and kind of kill his momentum. But he's a guy that I've been playing a lot this year, and I'm kind of interested to play this week, especially in GPPs. Had a T11 here in 2021, and the form's been pretty solid. Justin Suh is a guy that I know you like as well.
Yes.
As an overall prospect. He's an explosive player. He can handle these types of golf courses. And Ben Griffin, guy we saw play really, really well. He's a North Carolina native, so he's very familiar with this area. So he's a guy that we saw play really well kind of initially to start the year. He's cooled off a little bit, been a little bit quiet. But I think Ben Griffin's worth a look. And then my man from last week, Akshay. I don't know how, the question with a lot of these young players a lot of the time, Spencer, is how they're going to handle success. Akshay was in the mix last week, played really well, hung in there. Is he going to be able to carry that momentum over to a tournament such as this week, or will there be a letdown? I just think he's a super talented kid. So I don't mind taking a stab in GPPs. As we get into the 6s, Spencer, this is a deep field. I feel like you can go down here. You don't necessarily have to this week. But do you have any kind of leans towards the bottom of the salary scale when we get into the 6Ks? Who you looking at from a salary saving perspective this week?
I do think it gets gross really fast in the $6,000 section. Like if I'm able to try to figure out the optimal build that I want to take, and you're not always in the situation where it's going to come out perfect with it, but like to me, I want to be more aggressive and have more exposure in that lower $7,000 range. And I'll name a couple golfers here since I didn't really touch on them, but I alluded to Steven Yeager a little bit. I think he's a very nice pivot away from some of those other players that he's going to be sub 5%. KH Lee, Kurt Kitayama, you mentioned Justin Suh. Like those are probably the 4 golfers for me that I'm trying to fit into builds to round out lineups there. But I don't know, Joe. It really does get gross fast. Like the top rated golfer for me in the 6,000s would be Will Gordon. That's from an overall perspective there. He's also the top upside play I have. I think you can consider Eric Cole at 6,800. I kind of like what he is as a golfer at this point. Like he continues to produce and the statistics kind of continue to show him as a top 50 player for me. So he's at least a name to consider. I know MJ Duffy last week absolutely burned everybody after coming in as one of the chalk plays at 8,000. And now we see him at 6,700, but I don't mind going back to him. It's going to be a 1% owned player that, you know, is a top 45 golfer for me in this field. So hopefully we get a bounce back from him. And then, I mean, I guess the other players I would at least want to ask you about, because I haven't made a decision. Like, do you have any thoughts on Austin Smotherman? Do you have any thoughts on Alejandro Tosti? Those are names that at least like they're still in under consideration for me. But like once we get lower than Tosti, it gets really bad fast.
I don't have any thoughts on those particular guys, Spencer. The guy that you mentioned, the kind of a bounce back candidate in MJ Duffy. My bounce back candidate, guy that absolutely destroyed me last week, is Aaron Rye. He can't get the putter going, man. I think he lost nearly 5 strokes putting last week in Mexico. Missed the cut. I was all over him, and it just didn't work out. Gained 2 strokes on approach. From tee to green, it's been going really, really well. And I think he's the type of guy that can handle this, this kind of Quail Hollow layout. So if we're talking bounce back candidates, I won't be as in on Aaron Rye, but I'll be there. I'll go back to the well a little bit. Harry Hall's a young player that's trending in the right direction. Putting some nice results together all of a sudden. He's a guy we were aware of on the Corn Ferry Tour. And all of a sudden we're starting to see some results, on the PGA Tour. Had a T10 in Mexico last week. You can argue what that's worth, but we've seen him play well in some of these opposite field events. Got plenty of distance, so you have to consider that on a layout like Quail Hollow. Dylan Wu's another player that I've liked recently that's been playing well. So he's a guy I'll give some love to down here. And it seems like a really, really ill course fit when we're talking about distance guys. But if you want to kind of zig when everybody else is zagging, Ches Reavie has been trending in the right direction. Had a T18 here back in 2019. And a guy, he's kind of like Davis Riley for me. I've got my young guys that I really like. That's Pearson Coody. I think he's really explosive. Has got the kind of game to compete on this layout. And it just feels like he's going to be one of those guys that kind of comes out of nowhere for a lot of people and wins a PGA Tour event pretty soon. Had top 15 finishes in each of his last 3 Corn Ferry Tour starts. So he's a young guy that's explosive. That I never mind throwing in GPPs because I'm just looking for the upside. But that's about it for me down here, Spencer. Is there anybody else you wanted to touch on in the 6Ks, man, before we get into the darts and hearts?
I guess the one name that I'll throw out there, just because we're talking about upside in this section, and like as far as Harry Hall goes, I'll never say no to a UNLV player. So I don't have a problem with him. I think Dylan Wu was another name that popped for me, but if you're kind of looking for that boom or bust option at sub 2% ownership, that's young, who has upside, we've seen it already in the season. I do think he wins at some point. A player like Davis Thompson is somebody that at least intrigues me. Like the ball striking is just so immaculate with what he's able to bring to the table. Around the green, the putting, there are major red flags there and you can't get around them. And I understand that. But if I even think there's a slight reduction that comes into play for around the green, which is what I keep talking about with why Cameron Young has found success, why Victor Hovland has found success. You can ignore some of the bad with him there. There is that potential that he shoots himself up to the top of the leaderboard or the first page of the leaderboard. So he's somebody that I at least want to throw out there as a name that probably has a lot more upside than meets the eye right now, and the floor is a miscut. I don't want to
Yeah.
sell that as anything other than that, but kind of what you're going to get with these $6,000 golfers anyway, because you said it best, Joe. Like, everybody has problems down here. Nobody has a clean profile. There's no golfer that's going to be, a play that you can pencil in for a made cut. Like, the safest player has technically been Michael Kim recently, who seems to keep making cuts. My model doesn't understand how that's going about with it, but I mean, it's a name to at least consider if you want to like try to get a made cut candidate down there. But for me, I'm trying to shoot for upside on a lot of these names. And that's the Davis Thompsons of the world. That's the MJ Duffys. It's some of these players that I'm hoping that their skill sets that they do bring to the table can give them a better chance to make a run for it, because that's what we're going to need. And specifically with the top of my board and my player pool, I do have a lot of chalk up there. Like, there's no
Yeah.
way around it. No matter how I
Yeah.
build it this week, it's going to be a very chalky construction. So I'm going to have to try to find differentiators at some point, because if I don't, and like the worst thing I could do, and I'll just pick on somebody, I'll find a random name here. I already mentioned him, so I guess I'll throw him out. Like, the worst thing I could do is to say, I'm going to play John Rahm, I'm going to play Cameron Young, I'm going to play Alejandro Tosti. Like, those are all the most popular players in their section. So that's more single entry than GPP for me. So it's like the Davis Thompsons allow me to at least deviate from that super. I mean, that's kind of like the prototype that everybody's going to put together. And I want to avoid that if I can in some of these spots. So it always comes down to ownership, Joe, as you know. Like,
Yeah.
it comes down to contest selection. It comes down to what you're in. And those are the answers. It's like, we can come on this show and we can give a million different opinions. But if somebody was telling me, find me a single entry lineup, find me the safest players, find me that, it's going to be all the Cameron Youngs, the Rory McIlroys. You can play the super chalk and be fine with it. But once you start deviating and you're in these contests, like, we'll call it a millionaire maker, but like millionaire maker type contests, like, you really have to branch out and get different.
Yeah, man. I mean, that's what makes PGA DFS so great, right? I mean, we can, to a certain extent, Spencer and I can kind of tell you who the good plays are, who we think's going to play really well from week to week. But that's not necessarily going to be what wins you a GPP, and wins you a huge takedown. So there's a little bit of art to the science that's tossed in there, and that's what I find so fun about PGA DFS. And we've talked about a lot over the years, Spencer, you and I specifically, differentiating lineups, as you mentioned, taking into account maybe the cumulative ownership of your lineup, versus, you can play your favorite players. You can play those guys that might be a little bit chalky, but you are going to have to change it up a little bit in some other roster spots. So, really love what you're saying, man. I think it's one of those things this week where there's some guys that we really like up the top, several guys that we really like up the top, that are probably going to be pretty popular. So we'll look down here at the bottom of the scale, kind of as the week progresses. Check me out over at Rotoballer. Check Spencer out over at Rotoballer. Check our buddy Byron out. He does a great value plays article that's available with Rotoballer PGA Premium that you can get over there every week. But just kind of keep searching, find a trait you like down at the bottom of the scale with some of these guys, and don't be scared to toss them in there in GPPs. Speaking of which, Spencer, you know what we do on this show, buddy? We do a dart play and a heart play. Let's pick out a couple of darts. We've kind of been camped out down here. Give me your dart play for the Wells Fargo Championship.
I'm going to go with Steven Yeager. Part of me wants to say Kurt Kitayama, because we've seen him win at an elevated event this year. And I do think he certainly has the potential. This is a really good course for him. Don't know if I love the form that he's bringing in recently, but Yeager's a golfer for me. Just to quickly touch on it, he's added distance here in 2023. The metrics are really starting to push into this territory where I think he's a legitimate top 40 type of golfer in the world, and we're not there yet with the rankings. And it's kind of like Yeager and Suh, and a lot of these names were these Corn Ferry darlings that just didn't really get off to the quickest start on the PGA Tour. And we're now starting to see them put it together week in and week out. And none of them have gotten to the point where we need them to take down some of these contests. But don't be shocked that within the next couple months, we either see Yeager or Suh win one of these tournaments. So I'm going to go with Yeager. I think he's a very interesting play.
Yeah, I like Steven Yeager. Chattanooga guy. Spent a lot of time in Chattanooga via Germany, so we like Steven Yeager on this show. I'm going. I think he's going to get a little bit of steam as the week goes on, Spencer. But I'm going to go Emiliano Grillo down here. Um, I just love playing him when he's hot, man, and I hate playing him when he's not. So I'm going to try to just hop on and ride it for what it's worth. And my dart will be Emiliano Grillo. I think there's some guys that we touched on as you get down the scale that you can take some shots with, even in a deep field like this. It feels like it's almost what you have to do this week, where ownership's going to kind of be concentrated a little bit. So I'll take a dart with Emiliano Grillo, keep an eye on the ownership as the week progresses. Give me your heart play, Spencer. Who's winning this thing? Throw the stats out the window. I know that's hard for you to do, but what's your heart telling you this week?
My heart tells me that Rory McIlroy wins this tournament, which kind of makes a really boring answer to give. I'll give a secondary name just so I don't go to the very top of the board here and try to make some sort of a unique answer with it. But if it's not Rory McIlroy, I'm going to say Sungjae Im.
Okay, okay. We're banging heads on Sungjae this week.
Yeah.
I got a feeling you're right. I got a feeling that I'm probably going to be the one that comes up on the short end of that. Sungjae seems to get me no matter which way I go with him. So Spencer's down for Rory as his heart play. I will go Spencer. I think he's going to eventually win one of these big tournaments. We've seen him in contention, and there's got to be a breakthrough at some point. He's just too good from tee to green. I'm going Victor Hovland. I love how he's been playing lately. In contention at the Masters. Kind of got a feeling for that fire. We've been seeing it. Played really well at the Players. So I just like his game on this golf course. Had a T3 here. The last time the Wells Fargo was played at Quail Hollow, shot 68, 67 over the weekend in 2021 to finish tie for third. So I'm going Victor Hovland. I'll be pulling for Ricky a little bit, though. I'd like to see him get in the mix. We're going to hop off. Spencer and I, if you want to hear, you're probably tired of hearing us talk, but if you want to hear us talk some more, we're about to hop on the PGA Draftcast with, I think Sia and Joel. Is that who we're doing it with, Spencer?
Yeah, so it's usually those two. Joel Shrek is not going to be able to do it tonight,
Okay.
so it will be the two of us. It will be Sia Najad. And jump into it, because if you're not aware of the show, you can draft a team with the audience, so you can compete against all of us. Obviously, Joe and I did not take the most savvy route here by giving all of our answers before we hop onto a show like that. But come into the chat, have discussions with us. We'll answer any questions that you have there. And as Joe said at the beginning, if you're not doing so already, we are very proud of what we have going here at Rotoballer. So be sure to check out the premium sections that we have, whether it's my tee-off package or the combination that we have with Joe, Byron, and myself. We're putting out a lot of work. We cover these tournaments from every perspective that you can find weekly, whether you want to find bets, DFS, you can get my model showdown contest that we put out. It's a lot of great work, and it's a really good value for the money that you're spending there. So we hope you consider checking that out.
Yeah, definitely for sure. I want to encourage you guys to check out rotoballer.com. We want to thank them for always standing behind us, and they're our partner on this show, so we appreciate that. I want to give a shout out to AP. I'm sure he'll be back next week. Kids Play Free in Tennessee. Check that out. Make a donation if you can. That's actually where Andrew is tonight. He's having dinner with Scott Stallings, raising money for kids golf in Tennessee. So good stuff there, AP. We appreciate you, buddy, and we'll look forward to seeing you back next week. Thanks so much, Spencer. And if you guys want to stay with us, just hop on to either of our Twitter accounts, and we'll retweet the Draftcast coming up here in just a minute. Thanks, guys.